Okay, hello everyone. Welcome to our Tuesday Similar Theory of Cyber Policy Center. My name is Sunny Liu. I'm Director of Research at Stanford Social Media Lab. Today, it's really my greatest pleasure to introduce Professor Jeff Hancock. Jeff is the Harry Norman Chandler Professor of Communication, the founding director of Social Media Lab, director of Stanford's Cyber Policy Center, and a senior fellow at Freeman Spogli Institute. He is widely recognized as one of the world's leading scholars on the psychological and social impact of technology, particularly on social media. Today, Jeff will share his latest work on categorizing, measuring, and mitigating social media harms among adolescents, a topic he has been deeply committed to long before it became a mainstream concern. In fact, Jeff began to ask hard questions about social media and impact on well-being more than a decade ago, and his research continues to shape both academic and policy conversations globally. I've had the pleasure to really work with Jeff for the past 9 years. He is not only a brilliant academic whose research, vision, leadership really shape how we think and how we work, but more importantly, he is really a truly generous and inspiring leader and mentor. At the Social Media Lab, we even have a term to describe like the magic of Jeff brings to our lab. It's called the Jeffified. So whenever there's like, when all our research ideas are Jeffified, usually those ideas become more compelling and intellectually sharp. When study design is Jeffified, it gets more elegant and insightful. And when paper is Jeffified, it reads more clearly and persuasively, open with a surprisingly twist that opens up a new way of thinking. But perhaps most important of all, Jeff is simply an extraordinary human being. He's kind, patient, and always takes time for all of us. Sometimes it's often the right to one of our members, we need appointment for medical appointment. And he always sends about nice happy birthday texts or emails to all of us, although sometimes maybe not on our birthdays. And also, I think that most importantly, Jeff always shows up to the things that matters most. That is our members and people around him. I think that Jeff really makes everybody in his orbit feel supported and seen. Please join me to really welcome Professor Jeff Hancock.
Jeez, Sunny's gonna make me cry. Thank you for that lovely intro, Sunny. I'm so glad it was recorded. If I'm ever feeling down, I can just go watch the live stream. Really appreciate that. For those of you that like Nate's work, often it's been Jeffified, and that's why. So just so you know. I am really pleased to be here to talk about this. As Sunny said, this is something that's been really important to me and my research team for a long time. And I'm often the person in the room that likes to emphasize the value that social media can bring people. With people like Angela Lee, I focus on agency and how we can use social media, help people use social media in ways that are positive for them. But what I always think is important is taking this balanced approach. And so today I'll be focusing more on the harm side of this. And I've been very grateful to be able to work with Eleni Linos, who's over in the med school, as she is the director of the Center for Digital Health. She, along with her staff over there, along with KX Jin, who couldn't be here today, and Eleni couldn't either, they have another event. Sunny played a big role in putting this together. We were able to bring together a pretty incredible and diverse group of workshop participants in which we had everybody from various different perspectives think about what are all the harms that have been discussed and described in the academic literature, or from that the platforms are worried about, or that policy folks are concerned about, put them all into one place and then discuss what we can do about them. There's lots of reasons that this is sort of urgently needed. And that's because a lot of the regulations that are starting to emerge around the world, from Australia to Brazil to Colombia and to Europe, all countries now that have regulation that bear on this, they're starting to ask these questions in policy and law. So first of all, what are the harms that a policy is going to address, and how would you measure them? Right now, we're trying to move beyond simply, is social media good or bad? A question we've known has been problematic for at least 5 or 6 years. when I gave my lecture last week in Trust and Safety that I teach with Alex Stamos and Shelby Grossman, I asked the students how many of them thought for them personally social media was bad for them. Over half raised their hands. And so then we started to ask, well, why? And then we got into some of the tricky difficulties. And so this is part of defining what we mean by harms and moving beyond bad. Once we can define a harm and once we can measure it, the next thing we can actually do is try to mitigate it. It's very difficult to reduce a harm if we don't know carefully what it is, and we don't know if we're reducing it if we can't measure it. This is not an accident that we ask these two questions first. This is part of, for example, the DSA, the EU's new law around this that will be requiring large platforms, very large platforms, to answer these two questions. And they'll be legally required to do that. Finally, something that we have to think about here at Stanford, given the role we play in the Silicon Valley ecosystem, is sort of trying to balance safety with rights as well as with innovation. So we brought in workshop participants that represented not only industry, not only academia, but also civil society, including not-for-profits and government regulators. Okay, so these are the questions we're going to tackle here in the report. The report is available. Where do we have the hard copies? They're here at the front. So if anybody wants to follow along, come and grab one. But please take one on your way out. The team has done a really nice job of putting together a really nice, clean package. We didn't want to start from scratch. There's been a lot of work on harms already, and we wanted to come up with something that was integrating across the general space around harms. The Minnesota Attorney General's report was really focused on specific harms that have been highlighted by regulators. We had the World Economic Forum that had been looking at it globally, so not just in the US. What are the core harms that have been identified globally around youth and social media? The National Academy's report came out not last December, but the December before. I was one of the committee members that wrote that report, and there we focused on how social media is not one monolith, but rather there's these different affordances or functions that we should be thinking about when we think about different kinds of harms. And finally, our own group here, we were interested in bringing the microscope up a little bit. I think one form of myopia that I've had for a long time was thinking about the person and their engagement with social media and what that meant for their psychological health. But clearly, families are really struggling, and the child's use might be important for the family overall, or the way that the family, the parents are using social media could be problematic for the child. So trying to bring that up one level from our typical psychological perspective to a more social one. And ultimately, as you'll see, one of the things that's harder to get at are the harms that might accrue to a society but not to an individual. So this could be around the dynamics of news. But these are the four that we took as our starting place, and we integrated those into 22 harms. And we came up with 4 conceptual categories to make sense of those 22 harms. The first is threats to safety and criminal activity. These are things where when we talk to parents, we try to remind them that there are really different kinds of harms. These ones are adults interacting with minors for sexual extortion. CSAM refers to child sexual abuse material. These are the kind of things that are both illegal and also when a child encounters them or experiences them can lead to lifelong trauma. This is not about a couple of points on a Likert scale, whether that's anxiety or connectedness. This is about actual trauma. And so separating this as a harm from some of the others is very important to make sure we understand that this is a particular kind of harm that is distinct from others. The second category is health and well-being. As we heard 2 weeks ago, this developmental phase is really important around how people look, how young people are thinking about the way they belong to others, what their identity is. And so issues around self-harm and eating disorders can be particularly important for young folks. We considered other content-driven harms. This could be related to misinformation, being exposed to violent or upsetting content when not expecting it. And then we realized that there was a whole bunch of other kinds of harms that were difficult to categorize into these other three, and there wasn't another bucket. One of them, algorithmic bias, gets just a massive amount of attention, but as we'll see, the experts that we brought together judge this to be one of the more difficult ones to conceptualize. So these are the four kinds of harms that we ended up looking at. We asked this group of people who were the attendees of the project. So you'll see on here we have a lot of academics, but we also had a number of folks from the EU Commission. Just as examples, we had a researcher from the TikTok Health and Safety team, Common Sense Media, just to give you a flavor of the kind of people that were in the room. We gave them the 22 harms that we'd integrated across those four reports and those four categories that you saw, and we asked them to simply rate how important, and to what degree would you include this in a taxonomy of youth well-being and social media. They did this before the workshop. The idea here was to get people eyes on, preparing, thinking about it. They also were able to offer additional harms that they thought we were missing. And then we brought them together for one full day where we spent the entire day focusing on what are these harms, how prevalent and severe are each of them. We then spent a next part of the day working on measurement for each of the harms, and the last was mitigation. So again, following that, defining the harm, measuring the harm, and then thinking about mitigation. This is the big gnarly list. I'm going to break it down here in a little bit, but what I wanted to really emphasize is the degree to which there was some consensus. The color codes here represent the kinds of things that fit into each bucket. So this beige one is threats to safety and criminal activity, and you can see that, I'm going to walk over it, that they are right at the top in terms of the mean rating that our participants gave in the workshop. So at the top, adult to minor solicitation, image-based sexual abuse, sextortion. It had a mean of 8.91. Child sexual abuse material, same sort of level, 8.87. Basically, everybody felt that this was a huge, important, and key harm. We can also see over on the right there's the mode. For those of you that are forgetting your undergrad stats, the mode means what was the most common rating for this particular harm. Now I want you to see the top 5 are all pretty highly rated in here, and I'll go back to them in a minute. But you see in this mode, we can actually see that all the way down to 17 of the 22, there was agreement that this was a 9. This was something that was very important to be included in a taxonomy. So although there's a lot of debate in the scientific literature, there's actually a lot of agreement, I would say consensus is fair, that these harms are something that should be conceptualized, measured, and mitigations developed for. So it's a little different than, do we think it's absolutely causing, say, all the harm in a generation, but rather these are harms that we think are important to be measured and ultimately mitigated if they're present. Top 5, in addition to the 2 child and sex abuse topics, we have communities that promote self-harm or suicide. Again, important, especially for this developmental period. Bullying, harassment, and stalking. So this can be elevated to criminal, but it was about safety, right? People that are feeling that their physical safety is in danger. And the last was also a community content-based harm. Communities that promote eating disorders, dysmorphia, unhealthy body images. So those are the top 5. We can take a look down at the bottom ones. What were the ones that were not considered or didn't have a consensus that they were really important to include? The bottom one, parent use of social media. So the way that the parents are using social media was not, for example, considered a harm that platforms will need to measure and then mitigate. Surprisingly to me, algorithmic biases and risks was rated not as low as the parent use one, but still quite low. So the mode here was 8, so it's lower. But the concerns for the workshop participants was that it wasn't well defined, that algorithm bias in and of itself is not a harm, but rather that it's a mechanism. And this was an issue for a number of the harms and was a big part of the discussion, which is this something that we're trying to measure because it's a harm, or do we think this is a mechanism? For those of you interested in the full set of harms, please make sure you grab a report on the way out. Okay, so the workshop on going through the different harms came up with a number of key themes. The first is the notion of prevalence versus severity. And surprisingly, this is somewhat missing from the popular debate. So it could be that fairly often you encounter content that, for example, makes you feel like you're not as successful as other people. This is called social comparison, upward social comparison. And maybe that happens a fair bit when people go online, but the severity of it might not be that big of a deal. I come around and hang out with folks here at Stanford, and I don't feel like I'm doing as awesome either. But it's not that severe, it's not that important, right? So this is a common psychological thing. It's high prevalence, but it's not severe. Contrast that with, for example, child sexual abuse material, which is relatively rare, right? Very few children actually experience that, but for those that do, it's massive severity. And so trying to think about those two parameters are going to be really important as we think about both measurement and mitigation. That was one of the most important themes, I think, to emerge out of that. Second, I've already highlighted. When I ask my students, how many of you think social media is bad for you? And they, half the class raises their hand. What they struggled to articulate next was why. Right? What is it that is causing social media to cause harm for you? And so this is an important part that academics are also working on. What are the specific things in social media that are causing harm that might be, for instance, different than what you might experience in everyday life? Upward social comparison, me looking at other people and feeling like they're doing better than I am and making myself feel bad, is not unique to social media, right? This is a very common psychological experience. On the other side, though, the ability to share child sexual abuse material is enhanced and made much more possible than in the past because of social media. So thinking about mechanisms and outcomes is different. The other was around this sort of idea of actionability. Like what can we do? So for instance, if people are feeling anxious, if young people are indeed more anxious than other generations, what is it that is actionable about that? If, for example, social media is one of 5 or 6 causes that might be playing a role in the trend around anxiety, what is the action item for a platform? TikTok, for example, when it was developing its trust and safety teams, it was first coming to visit Stanford for the Trust and Safety Conference, were spinning up well-being teams. They were actually trying to get at this, like, we want our young users to be healthy. By healthy, we don't just mean they're getting healthy content, but that they're thriving in life. This is no longer the sort of bar many are going for, and even for academics, it's not clear what exactly is actionable. The last are these important things to think about this particular developmental phase. What of these harms are sort of specific to this group? They may be extra vulnerable. You have, for instance, adults targeting them because they're children, or you have psychological vulnerabilities that are unique to that phase. And so teasing apart things that are about harms that are going to happen no matter what your age is versus harms that might be unique to that phase. I'll call out, for example, body image type content that undermines the way people feel about their body. That is uniquely important to young people and different from how, for instance, the general population deals with it. Okay. The workshop then switched over to the second core objective, which was how do we go about measuring these harms? So we came out with a number of ways to think about each harm, but overall these were the different ways in which we think there are buckets of methods. The first, and the one that's probably underutilized, certainly in academia, is content. We know that there's some academic enterprises trying to work on this, like the Screenomics project here that takes digital images of your phone every 5 seconds. But content is really, really difficult to measure when you're outside of the platform. Most of the time, it gets moved up to metrics, which is how long were you on, say, social media, how long were you on your phone. But these content and behavioral metrics, everybody in the workshop agreed, are increasingly important. And we need not only platforms to be able to access them, but also researchers. The most common form of metric is user reports. So here we are giving people a chance to say how they're feeling while using the platform, whatever their social media was. But there was also very limited amount of feedback that the workshop participants thought the platforms are making available to users. But these are another vector of doing research where we could find out how people are doing. On the far right is the main way that we academics do this. We use validated scales, self-report. They're really important. They're the only way, for instance, to find out how somebody's feeling in terms of anxiety or depression or connectedness. But they tend to not be real well connected to content or metrics. And so while these three are recognized as important ways of doing this, there remain some challenges about connecting the different kinds of approaches. Here we can see the different challenges. I've already mentioned some of them. We are going to be partnering with the E-Safety Commission of Australia. The Australian government is instituting their social media ban. One major challenge is how do you tell how old somebody is? Massive privacy concerns there. The digital literacy side of this was, sorry about that. Yeah, right. So how do we go about making some of these, wait a minute, I think I went too far. Sorry about that. Oh, measurement approaches, okay. Then we moved on to mitigation strategies. These mitigation strategies were about how do we try to address the harms. So the goal would be define a harm, measure it, implement a strategy, measure the harm after the mitigation strategy has been put in place. These are some of the mitigation strategies that the workshop participants came up with. So age verification, improving the defaults so that minors don't have as open a space. We've already seen changes on the platforms for that. Digital literacy education, our group obviously is very excited about this as a way forward, making people better, so focusing on building up their resilience. Content moderation is a huge topic, especially right now with the advance of generative AI. Dave Wilner was at this workshop, and so you have seen the approach that him and Samit are working on around using LLMs to improve content moderation, so there's a lot of optimism there. Algorithmic interventions, so how do we use algorithms to show a user social media that reflects their values more than, say, the platform's values? Nate and I are working on a project with Michael Bernstein and a group in computer science to do that very kind of task, try to get at the sort of a middleware approach where we use algorithms to make the social media feeds fit us better. Last is to keep youth engaged. We had a number of folks that work with young people to work on co-design, so making sure that we bring young people into the design process so that they feel like their voice is heard in this as well. Okay. We made a series of recommendations for the platforms, for policymakers, for us researchers, and for parents. I'm going to go through them relatively quickly and not spend a ton of time on each so that we can save time for conversation. But for the platforms, and again, we had platform representation there. So there was some level of consensus that this is something that platforms can work on. Transparency and sharing data, way easier said than done. We've tried to crack that nut many times. Some of the requirements from the DSA and the EU may allow that to actually get opened up. This idea of thinking about the quality of content rather than just how much you're engaged, I think is really important. Anya Stevic, who is a postdoc in the social media lab, is doing a study with Meta to look at what young people think is high quality content for them that's both engaging but also makes them feel good about themselves, allows them to learn things, feel good about the world. So how do we think about content quality rather than just time? As I mentioned at the beginning, Angela Lee, who's been really at the forefront of getting people to think about agency and autonomy when it comes to social media. What are ways that we can enhance young people's sort of sense of control? When I asked my students, and they said that they felt like social media was causing them harm, one of the main things was that most of them felt it wasn't in their control. So how do we flip that? How do we change that in a way that's not just a change in attitudes, but a real change in their sense of autonomy? And the last is, there is no question, every parent in this workshop was like, the parental controls suck. They don't seem to work, they're broken, they don't last, kids are way smarter, they just seemed unhelpful, and that's a pretty common complaint. Okay, for policymakers, again, nothing too earth-shattering here. We do see these different regulations emerging around the world. Even within the United States, there are different states with different ideas for what regulations should be. It would be really great to see more integration across all these different regulation packages. Nate wasn't at this workshop, but I think I represented him. That is, how do we force data access for researchers? The voluntary approach hasn't been super successful. So that's something that the folks from the EU that were there, I think really heard loudly. Cross-platform initiatives. I like to think back to how Frank McCourt has talked about the way our data is locked into specific platforms. The analogy is oversimplistic, but back in the day, if you wanted a new phone, you had to get a new phone number. The phone numbers belong to the companies, and Frank always likes to point that as an analogy, is like that would make no sense and people would never use phones again. How do we make that where we can move around and have control of our data? And then this question of balancing safety, privacy, and rights, this has been so fascinating. One of the great things about this Cyber Policy Center is all the different government representatives that come from around the world to talk to us. It is so different. Every country just have a different way of thinking about this balance. Here in the US, the right to freedom of speech just sort of dominates everything, whereas when we visited Australia, okay, and our last two here is for researchers. I'm not going to spend a ton of time here because we all think about research all the time. The main thing that I really want to emphasize is this idea of actionable research. We don't need any more studies, I don't think, that correlate some kind of like anxiety scale with a general overall use of social media. We get it, there's a correlation. What can we do with it? What is research that we can move forward with that gives us some solutions to the kinds of harms that we're talking about? How do we empower users and policymakers rather than just finding a small correlation again and again? Finally, this is something that's been important for me and the Social Media Lab over the last year and a half. We've come to recognize that parents and families are at the forefront of the problem here. The number one complaint listed in the University of Michigan's recent social science survey is conflict about tech use in the home. That's number one. And it beats concerns around things like misinformation. It beats concerns around climate change. There's a struggle in the house right now. And how do we equip families to deal with this? And that's going to be potentially affected by a ban. If we ban phones in school, maybe that's going to be great for the school, but does that then increase use at home? We need to know these kinds of questions. We can't just say, okay, parents, you need to fix this. This is your responsibility. That's not right. But we currently aren't giving parents a clear and actionable message. And one thing the workshop tried to really articulate is that we need to support parents as we move forward. All right, I think I'll end there and look forward to the discussion. And thank you all for your attention. Really appreciate it.
What amazing talk, Jeff.
Thank you so much.
I have a lot of questions.
Okay.
My first question Is I think that we list this framework with 22 different type of harms. If you think about, are there ways we can pick top 3 or 5 harms? You think that is most we have to do actions right now for policymakers, families, and kids? If other some.
Yeah. One of the things that was really great in the workshop was just everybody agreed that these ones that were around criminal or physical threats, just like, it's a no-brainer. And that, I think when you can find places of consensus like that, that we can then address, everybody agrees, the platform should be held accountable, regulations should, enforce those and be explicit. We can start there because they have the most tangible and concrete harm. And it felt like there was a lot of consensus. So I think we would start there. Others where, here in the US, freedom of speech starts to get wrapped up, those are around content. The only thing that I think can still cross the aisle a lot is children, and maybe that's too optimistic, but I think content that could be harmful to kids, we will also have a fair amount of consensus on. How we go about doing that in the US is going to be more difficult than other countries.
That's great. I know that during the workshop, we have civic organizations, academics, policymakers there. What are not there, peoples are youth themselves. If we have family, parents and youth there, do you think that will provide different type of frameworks? What harms will be still same, or will they give us new harms framework to think about those harms?
Yeah, it's been interesting listening to young people. We've been doing interviews where we ask people in their 20s what they would tell their adolescent selves about social media now that they've experienced it. And there's a number of things. Interestingly, the things I just mentioned, threats to safety, threats to like criminal threats, I think most kids just assume like that's the case, like you've got that handled. And so they tend not to think about those because they're rare. They're rare even though they're severe. For them, one of the big challenges is, for instance, we talk about agency a lot. How do you have agency and control when you see both great content, high quality content, stuff that you find engaging but also is, healthy for you, alongside stuff that's really awful? And sometimes the awfulness for young people is just the news, right? You get so much news in social media feeds, and the news is all negative. This is not new to social media, but it's a time now where they're experiencing like this really great stuff alongside difficult content. So that was one of the things that we've learned, which isn't so much like a straight up harm, but a real challenge for how do we think about their experience when you have high quality stuff mixed in with really potentially harmful stuff.
Right. A follow-up question with this, I think that our research always showed that individuals are so different. Yeah. So each kid and each families have their unique social media engagement patterns, their individual differences. How can this framework we presented here, very academic, that can be really helpful for parents and for kids, how they can use them for this?
Yeah, that's great. One of the things I think in talking to parents that's become really clear is there's a high level of anxiety about kids and media. And the anxiety starts as like, okay, this is something that I don't have a lot of control of. I can't see it super well because they're watching it on their phone, and I'm worried. And their worry is highly generalized. And when we ask them questions, they definitely, I'll say mix up. It's not like it's a fault, but it's just part of the soup of anxiety. It includes things like, oh, my kid's going to feel worse because they're using a lot. Maybe they're not going to have as many social skills because they're displacing that. They're not sleeping as much. And also they're going to get attacked by strangers, or they're going to be involved in some kind of crime. And so when we talk to them and sort of separate out, like, hey, there's one thing which is like criminal things on your kid, and that's super rare. What about sleep? And then we can focus on that specific harm, and people seem to kind of calm down. So I think there's like a generalized anxiety that can be tamped down when you get specific, like these kinds of harms. You say, okay, what about this harm? Are you worried about your child with that? And they'll often say, well, no, not my kid. And so it allows them to go from the generalized population level concern to like, what's going on with your kid? At the risk of talking too much, I'll say the other thing that we've learned is heterogeneity. Different kids have different experiences of this highly, varied media. And so that's the other thing. And when we ask parents, like, what's going on with your kid, it really helps them think about what's going on with theirs and what their sort of concerns might be for that particular kid.
Amazing, Jeff. I know you have a daughter who is 15 years old. So what's the conversation like at home with Lennox about social media? What's this conversation like?
Yeah, I made them, her and her friends wanted a phone last summer when they were turning 14. There are 5 of them. And so I said, well, you guys have to make a presentation. I'll take a look at it, and then you have to convince the parents of the 5 families. Yeah, and so they gave the presentation, and my feedback, obviously, Sunny, was not enough Hancock citations. So they went back and improved that. And you know what was amazing is they were really aware of a lot of the challenges. I think that there's a lot more awareness. They also were much more articulate about why they wanted it. Most of them had watches. They could talk, right, and do that stuff. But they wanted other things. They wanted to be creative. They wanted to be more social. Like, this is a tool. Forcing them to talk about the tool then allowed the parents to see, okay, I could see the value. And then we talked about some, hardline rules and enforced them. After this workshop, which was last September, and my daughter had just had her birthday, just got this phone, I did have a conversation with her that I kind of feel like we should produce a template for everybody, as I talked about child sexual abuse material and adult solicitation, the way that currently AI is being used to trick young people into sharing photos and blackmail. The number of parents I've talked to whose kid has been trapped in this has been horrible. And so I talked to Lennox about that a lot. She now has I shouldn't say this, but she has her first boyfriend. I'm whispering on a live stream. What am I doing here? And we had the conversation, just a reminder, like, hey, let's talk about this again. And just in case that boyfriend's listening, I'm watching.
Yeah.
But no, it's a hard conversation.
Yeah.
She was embarrassed, I was embarrassed, and then we started talking about it, and she actually found it really quite useful. So I think having the ways of talking about like those real serious things is important, because it's a kid up against a criminal organization. This is not, they've had many reps of how to fool a kid, and the kid's doing it for the first time. So I think it's the general thing around phones, super useful. Like, not in the bedroom. Yeah, there's basic core hygiene, but having those conversations about those real severe harm is important.
Great. I have 2 more questions, but my phone is beeping because I think there are lots of questions from online. So if you're online, please keep sending us questions, and we're open to questions here soon. So I have last 2 questions. First one is, I think that let's move to individuals and think about policy at national level. I know that we'll be working with Australia eSafety for their evaluation of their social media minimum age regulation. So how would this framework we developed guide your thinking about how to do the evaluations for that?
Yeah, I'd say there's sort of 3 things that I've been thinking about with the Australian ban. The first I've mentioned, which is taking the microscope up a level and looking beyond just the kid. I get the idea there is certainly to help kids, especially in schools, but we also have to think about what that means for the family. So that's one. The second is, how does a ban that applies to everybody influence this sort of heterogeneity that we've been finding? Again, heterogeneity, just a simple way of saying that different kids have different experiences with social media. So if this ban protects a small population of kids from some of these severe harms, it may be worth the removal of the value to the other population of children, right? And so what I want to be able to do is have good measurement of those so that the government, on behalf of society, can make those decisions about thinking about balancing harms versus rights, that kind of thing. The third and the last one is to not just focus on, for example, anxiety. It's not to dismiss the importance of that, but to instead get to more concrete things around what social media may or may not be doing. And we're going to be measuring anxiety, obviously, but let's think about the whole range of harms and measuring them carefully so that then the government can make specific calls to reduce those kinds of harms.
Great. It says Stanford is 2025, so we have to ask about AI.
Yes.
So if you think about this report, focus a lot about social media harms. what you're thinking about the framework to use to think about harms of AI, especially on youth?
Yeah. So the first is Ryan Moore, who's here, and his colleague Ross Dahlke at Wisconsin has looked at the prevalence of AI in, for example, misinformation, which is one category of harm, in the 2024 election, and found it to be there. It was about 6% or so of the untrustworthy websites were generated by AI, but still really small relative to the sort of world of untrustworthy content online. Similar, when we had our rear view conversation with all the platforms that Nate hosted in December, they didn't see AI as a major player. I think the same thing right now in the well-being space. It's not a player yet in terms of harms, but it has the potential. How? Right now we're seeing at the corporate level a lot of impersonation attacks. So impersonate the CEO of a financial company in order to defraud people. Typically that kind of pattern starts with high value targets and then works their way down the population. And so at some point, kids will be getting blackmailed with the use of AI to improve their ability to impersonate others. Yeah. So it's coming. I think so far we haven't seen it as a massive current problem.
Thanks, Jeff. Let's open questions to the people here, and we should have a mic running. So let's first go to Nate and Devney.
So one point that's in the report that I think is critical here, and I sort of think of these harms in a kind of matrix, which is what are the unique harms for kids versus everybody, and what is unique to this technology as opposed to its predecessors, right? And so I think with each one of these, right, there are examples of these harms happening before, but really focusing on like whether we're talking about social media or we haven't really drilled down as much on that, whether it's social media, screens, whatever, phones, and what is it, what are the characteristics of that technology specifically for kids, I think is really the way to approach this. And so that could be things like the fact that they are much more empowered and solitary in their consumption of it as opposed to television, maybe, which is more observable, a whole other set of things. And so that I'm eager to get a sense whether the National Academy Report did that. Right. But another way to break this down, and I know you and I have talked about this before, another vector is that boys and girls are different, right? In their consumption, or what in the harms that people attribute, the trends, of course, we're not saying all, right? And so thinking about this set of harms in a kind of more gendered way as to what are the particular types of harms that we think boys are experiencing. And I just watched I don't know if you saw the series Adolescents, right? Yes. That a lot of people are watching. And then what are the harms that girls are watching? Because I think a lot of this, particularly the body image stuff and the FOMO, and I mean, a lot of that is gendered in the way that people are thinking about those harms.
Yeah. It makes me think back to our conversations with Lisa D'Amour, who visited Stanford and gave a talk for us last year. And she focuses on girls. And she was really thoughtful about the way young women typically develop, right? So there's a lot of variance in development. But this idea that like around 14, her view was, there's this sort of executive control comes online that wasn't there before. And that comes online later for boys. And so she was really interesting, I think, in really zooming in on thinking about girls, what their goals are, needs are, and how those might differ from other members of the family. But generally, I just view this, Nate, as part of that heterogeneity, that gender is one way of slicing that, and that gender is a very broad stroke differentiator for people. There's probably more overlap than there is distinction, but recognizing these real important differences. And most of the bans and most of the regulations that have been put out there so far don't really consider heterogeneity. And it's not unusual. I mean, if you think about it, the driving ban, it wasn't like, well, we should let girls drive before boys because, let's face it, they're smarter and mature faster. It was like, no, we're doing it at 16 or whatever for that country. So I think that's the tricky part, is like, how do you take into account these individual differences that sometimes come down to demographics with meeting the road on policy and not prioritizing by race, category, identity. Yeah. Thanks. Daphne.
I have a question, but I want to add to the gender discussion just quickly because I don't think we've talked about transgender kids yet and the ways in which they're uniquely put into danger by being cut off from access to supportive resources on
Right.
the internet,
Right.
which I think is, that's sort of the extreme of the spectrum of different kids needing different things. But if the proposals that we have are all about cutting off access, that's who suffers the most.
Yeah, and Daphne, I want to follow up for a second because I think that's super important. It's related to the heterogeneity, but I'll take it up one level, which is when your identity is not welcome or accommodated in your physical community, you're at risk. And you've always been at risk. But now this technology came around that allowed you to find community, allowed you to have expression, connect. That is one of the values that social media can provide. And so that's one of the concerns that this ban has. In Australia, for example, Indigenous youth may be particularly vulnerable to the ban.
Thank you. So my question is about kind of the gap between thinking about well-being and thinking about harms. So as a parent of teenagers, I think a lot about how, at one point in their lives, I wanted them to just never encounter anything hateful in the world.
Right.
And now I want them to figure out how to navigate that because they're going to encounter that in the world. I want them to figure out how to live in a world of skinny models and people talking about extreme diets and be resilient in the face of that.
Right.
And that only happens if they do encounter content that's somewhere on the spectrum of being bad for a lot of these lines. And the bottom line with a recommendation like this, particularly if it feeds into the Digital Services Act and other regulations, is platforms will look at this and be like, okay, this is the list of things to take down.
Yeah, right.
Or age gate or
Yeah.
demote or whatever. And the side of the balance that's like, and these are things kids need to eventually figure out how to deal
Yeah.
with in the world,
Yeah.
is represented here at most by the one line about infringement of child rights,
Yeah.
which got the only 5
Yeah.
in a group that included a bunch of regulators.
Yes. Yeah,
So
yeah.
I think it's not realistic to think the regulators are going to add that side of the balance, and that leaves the platforms who receive reports like this being left responsible for identifying that side of the balance.
Yeah.
And I don't think they're going to do it very well.
Right.
So I'm just curious in terms of the studies, the academic input, how this gets framed. Where does that side of the balance come from in informing what platforms are supposed to do?
Yeah, so one of our colleagues that worked on this, and I'll leave him unnamed, was thinking about, if you were to put a tiny tax on the revenue that social media companies make, and you took that tax and you put it into digital literacy programs throughout the country, and you made those digital literacy programs legit, real, not stupid, that kids roll their eyes at or whatever, but the kind of thing, our group has really been trying to work on, what would be digital literacy that's actually engaging people want to do. That's what I want my kid to have, those skill sets, that resilience, building it up. I think Common Sense Media has done a good job. We're seeing some of the things like Will Schultz here is building spaces that somebody can go into. Everything is AI. Everything you encounter, everybody you encounter is AI. And you can get some reps on, how do you deal with a jerk? How do you deal with somebody that tries to trap you into giving them some problematic photos? Because I completely agree with you. John Haidt and I disagree on a number of things, but one thing he and I really do agree is that parenting has changed in this important way where it's about almost entirely about protection and a lot less about good luck and I'm here, but there's going to be some broken bones or bruised elbows or whatever. And so that was his view. In the 90s, it was all about that. And now there's been this shift towards full protection. Perhaps that's also being reflected here. A lot of the regulators, researchers, they're also parents too. And so I agree, that side of the ledger, I don't know if the platform should be responsible for it. But if we think that there are harms flowing out of that idea of a tax that then supports in the same way that helped with smoking cessation, could be a way to go forward with it.
I mean, they're unavoidably responsible for it.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. I would think of it maybe like not an organization, so say a campus or a workplace, right? You're going to encounter problematic people. You're going to have problematic conversations. You're going to be upset. How do we help people be good at that? You know, and I don't know what the example is, but are work organizations the place to do that? You see now, like, executive coaching has become a huge thing, especially for younger workers, to help them, you know, develop skills to become better at handling problematic or difficult conversations. So, yeah, they're going to encounter it. Are the platforms responsible for helping them get better at dealing with it, or is that a society level function? I don't know, or responsibility. But yeah, thanks. Hi,
Yeah,
Mitchell.
hi, Jeff. I was
This
just
table
wondering.
is very active. I'm just waiting for Frank now.
No, we just have one more to go. But I was just wondering if you found any kind of insights into the level of harm based on the platform. Like, was it certain platform that had causing higher harm, or
Yeah. No, we didn't.
in any of the categories?
Yeah, we didn't dive into it by platform. There are taxonomies that look at that differently. And for example, you know, Ryan's work on exposure to untrustworthy content looks at like what platforms are leading to more of it. Here, the focus was instead on some of the things Nate was getting a little bit, which is what we call affordances. What kinds of things on platforms are more likely to lead to harm? So clearly, like, feeds are going to be much more about content, but private spaces like direct messaging are where bullying can take place. And so I think one of the things we tried to do in the National Academy of Sciences report was to stop saying just social media generally and start thinking about, well, what exactly is it you're trying to do, or what part of social media are you on? Because it can be anything from a DM to a video share to content that you posted. So I think that's more the way we were thinking about it. But there are some reports looking at how harms are differing by the different ones. So for example, Snapchat tends to have more adult to child harm reporting than other ones. And what's his name from the Psych of Tech, Ravi, he presented here. And so you could take a look at some of those taxonomies. Yeah, thanks, Mitra.
Yeah, we have a couple of great questions from online. First one is think about different type of harms. For example, terrorism, gun violence. How do you think about those type of harms? What do you think where they fit in different type of categories?
Yeah, so it was definitely discussed as a other content harm, which I know is a pretty not great final title for it, but there's these harms that in some ways and in some countries, this kind of content is accepted and valued. So gun violence, for example, is much more common in media here in the US than in other places. And yet, you know, there is research that suggests there can be a link between those things. So maybe it goes more back to what Daphne was saying around, you know, children's rights. Like, do you prevent them from seeing any violent kind of content at the risk that you're violating their ability to see that content? So tricky one. It's that like gray area where a lot of the students, as I was saying, they complain because their feed contains both good high quality content that they enjoy and feel good about themselves, and then also some violence that they absolutely were not looking for but encounter. Yeah.
Great.
Tricky one.
Yeah. The second question from online is, what are the greatest myths your research, empirical research, has been refuted?
The greatest myth. That's a good one. And I should have a just ready, snappy answer. I think the biggest myth is that we are really conscious of how much we use social media. One of the things that we've seen for over a decade in studies is that we ask people, how much do you think you spend on social media? They say N number of minutes or X number of times, and they dramatically underestimate that. I don't know. What do you think, Angela? Is there a better myth that we've shown now that you have your mouth full from chewing? What's another
Thanks.
myth?
Sorry, caught off guard. I think another myth that we see a lot is kind of around the failure to think about heterogeneity. I think it's really easy for people to say social media is good for this group of people, it's bad for this group of people. And like you were saying, you can slice it any direction, boys, girls, people of different ages. But there's also so much heterogeneity within and across those different groups that is also really worth paying attention to. Like, so for example, with the concerns around body image and eating disorders and problematic content that promotes those two behaviors. There's a lot of content that's targeted towards young boys in terms of problematic eating and bodybuilding and, you know, many kinds of restrictive eating that goes under the radar if we don't think about how people within these groups can also experience these different kinds of harms.
Yeah, that's a good one. Yeah, thank you. That's really great. Yeah, those are good. It's hard to talk about the myths. It's sort of like misconceptions or something like that. But yeah, that's a great question. I'll have to work on that.
Okay. So Jeff, I think follow these empirical research questions. I think in your slides you mentioned about actionable research. Could you give some example about actionable research and how to do that?
Yeah, so I think the kind of research that I think is being called for by the workshop here in this taxonomy is things that platforms can use to either measure and mitigate, that researchers can do, that we can share with families, that we can share with users. And then finally, policymakers are desperate for this kind of thing where it's not just these simple high-level correlations, but rather like, okay, here's this specific kind of thing. So I think work that's actionable has that sort of specific definition of a harm, the mechanism behind it, how to mitigate it, how to measure it. So I think if we could really push forward, I think the DSA has been really valuable for this very reason.
I didn't see any. I don't want to jump if anybody else has a question. Oh, okay. Do you want to? Well, do you want to take it then? Raise your hand. But I'll follow afterwards.
That's good.
Yeah, I was just wondering, in terms of the prevalence versus severity, what you feel like the kind of consensus in the field is for trying to address it at a societal level, and create the greatest harm reduction, or focus on individuals who are at most risk of high harm, whether or not you agree with what the consensus is, and like if you think that should vary between platforms.
Yeah, love it. So also, everybody, please welcome Zach. He's a new pre-doc here at Stanford. He'll be starting this summer. Yay, hi, Zach. And great question. Zach's has done some work with the ABCD data set on social media and neuroscience. So I think I have a bias as a psychologist, which tends to think about people more like individuals and their social environment. And so I think there are a lot of interventions that can be around the individuals, how they can build agency, how they can focus on connection, be mindful. But I've become increasingly aware of how that focus misses societal level concerns. So for instance, if everybody is just seeing, their unique content, how do we form common ground at a societal level? If there are small effects that are really not that important to an individual, but when you have that multiplied by millions of people and it influences a society, for instance, say around politeness, those are concerns that I think rise above. But I think you need two different kinds of approaches. Makes me think of like psychological approaches for one and sociological approaches for others. And a lot of times those aren't super reconcilable, but both important. Thank you.
All right, so this allows you to think whimsically.
I love it. And you're like the opposite of a pre-doc. So
yeah, right. I'm so post-doc at this point. It's scary. So assume that we could define what social media is and assume that we could ban it. All right, effectively. Yep. Both problematic assumptions, but assume you could. What do you think would be the psychological / social disadvantages of that? If we could do that for, say, under 16-year-olds, what would be the worst thing you think? Because I think a lot of people would support that if it could be done, for bad reasons maybe. But so what do you think would be the downsides to that? Again, it would be for all of them, right? Not just a school specific or something.
Right. Tricky one, and obviously super important. So I think that heterogeneity makes it really difficult, but there's going to be winners winners and losers. So some populations are going to suffer from belonging, while others will, potentially see a lot more engagement and could improve. So we'll see differences by, population. Some of the ones, for example, Daphne and I were talking about. I think I'm actually fairly optimistic that for most there will be some positive outcomes. The reason for that is I think children are super adaptive. I'll just tell a very brief, anecdote, which is I had some colleagues come. They were going to be on sabbatical for a year. They were really worried about their kids, moving them. They were 6 and 8. They were worried about them getting into school and like finding friends, but they were really excited about their sabbatical. 8 months later, they're like, how are the kids? The kids are loving it. They've made all these friends. They're just great. How are you guys doing? So lonely. We don't really like it here, right? And so kids are, we forget how adaptable and much they can adjust. So I think that if there is a ban, one of the things that could be really valuable is if my buddies aren't doing it, then I don't feel like I need to do it, and we're all on the same playing field, and it's going to be okay, and we just adjust and adapt in the same way that they kind of adapted to having it available. Like by and large, most younger kids, when you ask them how they're doing relative to social media, they fall in that middle thing. It's neither great nor is it horrible, and so they just adapted to it. Now, will they adapt to not having it? I think there will be some loss. I think there'll be some gain. But I think overall kids are just really much more adaptive than we give them credit for. So I think overall it'll be potentially positive. Now, I do worry a little bit about it getting pushed out into family time, and that we see conflict within families increase without any help. If we don't help families out at the same time that we do the ban, that could be a place where we see some suffering.
Okay, thanks so much, Jeff.
Great.
Thanks for this wonderful discussions.
Thank you, Sunny.
We have a hard copy here. If you want to take a copy on your way out, we also have an online version that if you can scan this QR code, that will be available there too. So next week we'll have Jonathan Chen, who will talk about AI and that implications for medicine and health. So please join